Well, thank you very much, Kevin, and to the Manning Center for the opportunity for partnership. Cardis has, for several years now, partnered with Manning at this conference. We run our own concurrent conference inside of the Manning Conference, as well as participate in these events, and it's been our privilege for the last 2 years to sponsor a plenary session. It's a privilege for me this morning to introduce our keynote speaker, Father Robert Sirico. I'm pleased to introduce him not just because, as an expression of Canadian hospitality to a friend from south of the border, but also because he's going to discuss a topic that I fear is sometimes too little discussed in our public conversation: ethics in American politics. Father Sirico joins us today from Michigan. He's the co-founder of the Acton Institute, based for the study of religion and liberty. Acton is based in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. It's consistently ranked highly in the United States Global Think Tank Index, and it argues for a vision of society that is free and virtuous. Acton is well known for its Summer Acton Institute program that gathers almost 1,000 students to Grand Rapids each summer. Father Sirico himself has a Master's of Divinity degree. He is regularly published in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Washington Times, First Things, as well as many other media outlets. He lectures in colleges and universities around the world and is a go-to commentator on several major television networks on topics such as civil rights, private enterprise, and ethical economic behavior. Father Sirico is going to talk to us about ethics in politics, and we can wax philosophical about ethics. I think for me, the exemplification of ethics is making sure that we deal with the various things in the right order and with the right priority. In many ways, ethics is about choices between competing ideals. Just to illustrate, I think what represents an appropriate view, not just from a personal but also from a social order perspective. I was scheduled to be in Grand Rapids just a few weeks ago, had arranged to meet with Father Sirico to sort of talk through what we were going to talk about. And I came at the appointed time to the Acton Institute, and Father Sirico's assistant came out and said, "I need to apologize, but there has been an emergency in Father Sirico's parish, and he is attending to the needs of his flock." I could have looked at that in a negative way. I came all the way from Calgary to Grand Rapids, but actually, after that slight moment of disappointment that was there, that our meeting wasn't going, and he was very gracious in setting up others, and we accomplished that elsewhere. About 30 seconds later, it struck me, you know what? This is exactly the right ordering of things. It's a reflection of the priority of institutions other than the states and other than politics, institutions of family, church, parish, of having priority, of being more important. Someone was suffering in his parish, and he was called to care for them. And in many ways, I think it was exemplifying of the very message I expect we'll hear something about as we deal with the different institutions of society and our different responsibilities, making sure we put things in the right order. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Father Robert Sirico.
I do apologize for that. And it wasn't just somebody who needed their hand held. It was a very serious thing, and I needed to be there. And as is always the case in those circumstances, I'm enriched by the encounter with human vulnerability, and delighted now to be here in Canada. Finally, last night, I got a drink of Crown Royal. I was waiting for a long time, and then I finally got it. And then this morning, on my crepes, I had some maple syrup, so I'm satiated. I've truly been to Canada, so thank you for your warm hospitality. I think it's often the case that outsiders can detect things that perhaps the insiders just are so comfortable with, you no longer tend to notice. If there's anybody here who's writing a doctoral or looking for a doctoral dissertation to write, I think an intriguing one might be to look at the flexibility, the innovativeness of our two nations, Canada and the United States, and how we in many ways owe our self-reflective, indeed at times self-critical capacity to our embrace of immigrants. Because immigrants come and they see things that to us are hidden in the fabric of society, and they point them out to us just by the lived experience and enable us to grow as cultures, as nations, even as economies. And I got a puppy a year ago, and a cute little dog, but it took friends coming over who were infrequent visitors to the house to point out to me that the puppy had grown up because I lived with the dog and I didn't see this growth. In this sense, I find it interesting to return from time to the writings of Alexis de Tocqueville as a visitor to the United States in the very first decades of the experiment that has come to be known as America, and to see the new shades of meaning that de Tocqueville detected, this French aristocrat who comes to this pioneering people. And he makes an observation. You've perhaps read the two-volume tome, Democracy in America. And there's a section from it that I want to cite to you that'll perhaps help frame our discussion for this morning. Here's what he said, this particular section. Despotism may govern without faith, but liberty cannot. And then he goes on to ask, how can it be possible that a society should escape destruction if the moral tie is not strengthened in proportion as the political tie is relaxed? And what can be done with a people who are their own masters if they are not submissive to the deity? Close quote. What I particularly think is pertinent for our discussion is this juxtaposition between the political tie and the moral tie. It tells us about a way that people can be governed without intrusive, distant, and frequently uninformed bureaucracies. And so was the case for much of the history of the United States, governed by what we called a moral consensus, a set of agreed upon social boundaries, less defined by particular dogmas than by a shared anthropological assumption about human dignity and the solidarity that resulted from a common identity that saw the delimitation of political and bureaucratic exercise, or its chief social expression, as less a hampering of the political mandate and much more an expression of a vibrant social reality of who Americans, qua human beings, are. In this view, family, traditions, social norms, religious ties, often exceeding denominational bonds, all form to contribute to an existential reality that was society. This lived reality is not so much a hatred of government as much as it was an assumption of what it means to be part of such a society, the bonds thereof emerging from what can rightly be called this moral consensus. Now, in this vision, government and its action has its role, but it was seen as a subsidiary role in society and never confused with the priority of culture and the priority of society for which government exists, and not the reverse. Therefore, not all of its expressions needed to be debated in the halls of power or promulgated in legislative texts. Indeed, nor could it, because it all went, this sense of governance went much deeper into the psyche, into the DNA, if you will, of the American people. Under this regime, in fact, if you'd like to call it a regime, one sees common sense, neighborly concern, and knowledge of our neighbors, too. Remember that. And yes, to tell the truth, we would also see the limits of cultural prejudices and prejudices, which generally oversee the dynamic ebb and flow of people's interaction with one another. The social cooperation admittedly was rough and uneven at times, but it was pliable, it was flexible, indeed it was cooperative. Now I grew up at the end of this situation that I'm describing, the end part of that history in 1950s New York. And it's remarkable how a stickball game on the streets of Brooklyn makes this point better than all of this kind of abstract language that I've been using. So come with me back to a memory of some more than 50 years ago, when I would play stickball in my neighborhood. For you, I don't know if you have stickball up here, but it's baseball played on a street. It's reoriented to a street. And there may be 8 of us boys playing. The girls would be chewing gum along the street as we were playing. And the one manhole cover was home plate, and the 1950s Rambler would be first base, and the other manhole cover would be second base, and then the Keating's station wagon, they were good Catholics, so they needed a station wagon. That would be third base and home. And it's played with a stick rather than a bat, and it's played with a soft little ball. Now, in this cacophonous scene, presiding over the whole thing is Mrs. Rabinowitz, who is sitting on her stoop. That is a porch. And so she's sitting there and watching all of this activity, and generally watching the neighborhood. My mother called her, I'll slip into dialect, the mayor of the neighborhood. She was just kind of this self-appointed, bossy, nosy little Jewish lady who would sit out there. And if this game became too rambunctious, if some superlatives were thrown across the street from one to another, Mrs. Rabinowitz would look at you. She'd call your name, and she'd say something like, "Robert, I'm going to tell your mother." And this would calm this whole group of teenagers down, and we continue with our game. Now, you know as well as I do, because that's not sui generis. It's not just Brooklyn, is it? The Mrs. Rabinowitzes all over our societies have retreated from their stoops, and with good reason. But I suggest to you that what holds society together, really, is something even much more than the Mrs. Rabinowitzes on their porches, day in and day out, who knew their communities and who were known by them and respected by them, because they'd tell our mothers. I think that is much more potent than the array of politicians who are only vaguely known and rarely know personally the constituents and what went on. This is governance without government. I say without government, I don't mean that we don't need a police force and all of the rest of it. But what I'm saying is that the core of real society, lived society, is this common consensus, a common moral consensus. You know, Jesus in the book of Matthew is handed a coin with the intention of creating a political stir. And he turns the whole question on its head. And in doing that, in this simple little encounter, sets forth a way of thinking that has reverberated down 2,000 years. He's asked, "Do you pay the tax?" And Jesus looks and says, "What's the face on the coin?" You remember this. Caesar's face. And he says simply, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." The late sociologist Robert Nesbitt amplifies this distinction by teaching us that there are 2 forms of constraint in society. One is an external form of constraint, which he calls power, and the other is an interior form of constraint, which he calls authority. So that we submit to authority when we acquiesce to its commands, not because there's a police force or jail sentence awaiting us, but because at some level we acquiesce to this authority. Power is when you do it because you will go to jail or you will be regulated or there's some physical penalty of one kind or another that mandates that you do this. Which is more effective? Which promotes real society? And that is the question, I think, that brings us to the ethical concern. I think much of what I have said was at one time, less so today, the lived experience of the American people in all of its diversity, with all of its mistakes. And I fear that there's a sense of that will be lost, and if it is lost, we are at a perilous point in history. In closing, I just want to leave you this image. It's the image of a tree that was growing out in front of the house that I was in for 14 years. I had just moved in, and we knew that there was some renovation that needed to be done, and so we were doing it as I was part of a religious community at the time. And there was, right off the front porch, this huge tree that went up above the house. And I noticed at the top of the tree there were some leaves, but that as you looked down the tree, in various parts of the tree, there were also a lot of dead leaves. There were living leaves mingled with dead leaves. So we called a tree doctor. I'm from Brooklyn. I didn't even know such a thing existed. We had one tree in Brooklyn. I saw it once before they got it. And so the tree doctor came and he looked around, he picked up some of the dead leaves and crushed them in his hand, and he dug around at the roots and picked off some of the bark, and he came up to the porch where I was sitting watching his forensic investigation, and he said, the tree's dead. I said, how can the tree be dead? It's blossoming. Look, there are living leaves up at the top of the tree. He said, no, that's just an illusion. I said, what do you mean it's an illusion? He said, the roots are dead, but the tree in the trunk had enough of the sap that it pushes it up. But eventually, the tree will come down in a Michigan rainstorm, perhaps on your house. So you need to remove the whole tree. And I think the question before us is a question of the roots. Do we understand our respective foundings? Do we understand even our shared anthropological presuppositions, who we are, what builds society, what causes society to flourish? Or are we simply living off the illusions of the past, simply having fun, not considering those roots? And I suggest that if we're going to save our respective societies, that we're going to have to return to the roots to understand what makes society cohere, and that is invested in an understanding of human dignity, of human solidarity, of the society that needn't be merely free, but virtuous as well. Lord Acton said that liberty is the delicate fruit of a mature civilization. And I suggest to you that this is what we need to tend to now, that delicate and precious fruit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father Sirico. You talked about Mrs. Rabinovich, and as you were telling that story, a reminder came of a recent issue in Hamilton, Ontario, where the Cardis office is located, where City Council put forward some regulations and bylaws limiting tobogganing to one particular hill. And as I listened, it struck me in terms of the very nature of regulation and freedom. I wonder if you could muse out loud a little more, expand on the point of, we often think of rules of the sort of thing that you were doing, and Mrs. Rabinovich as restricting the freedom of the boys on the street. Yet, if I understood you correctly, you were sort of contrasting that sort of moral code, which allowed freedom for stickball and however many variations of it, as opposed to the government, the political order that puts regulations that says, well, somebody might get hurt somewhere, therefore no one can ever toboggan. Can we talk about, for a moment, the notion of the liberty, the liberation and the freedom as opposed to the imposition of a Mrs. Lubinowicz?
Well, you know, I think the thing is, when you look at that image of Mrs. Rabinowitz, there's a lot of governance going on there. It's not freedom in the sense of do anything. I mean, there were even rules in the stickball game. You know, you didn't have a game if you didn't have rules, if there wasn't a parameter set. It's no fun to go to a game and cheat. Eventually, if everybody's cheating and there's no penalty for cheating, there's no game. And it's the same thing with Mrs. Rabinowitz. She was restricting our behavior, but not because she was threatening us with arrest. And I think the difference between the kind of abstract governmental incentives and concerns, which are reflective of human solidarity, that is to say, I don't think that people create regulations, well, maybe some do, just because they want to control people. I think they're concerned about kids getting hurt. The question is, do they know the kids? And who knows the kids better? And I think that that hill where the tobogganing has been limited to may or may not be safe for those kids, but I think the parents and the kids themselves are going to know that better. And now you're going to get some crazy kids that are going to go off a roof anyway. So you make a legislation, you say you can't jump off the roof. Okay, fine. I mean, eventually, at some point, we have to have a balance here. And what I'm suggesting is that the more informed governance takes place at the most local levels. So, okay, let's let the police department locally say this hill is safe and that hill is not. Because they're going to know the neighbors, because they're going to hear the history of the reports of kids who've gotten hurt.
If I can segue from that, the Acton Institute, which you head and are identified with, is perhaps its best known program is in the area of poverty and dealing with poverty. And one of the things that you've emphasized is alternatives to government, you know, the subsidiarity principle, pushing down and looking at other institutions. Have conservatives generally in North America sort of fallen into either this markets, it's either individual choice and there's no regulation at all, or it's government regulation, and lost some of the potential of some of the institutions in between? Can you reflect on that with using poverty and some of your experiences?
Yeah, I think in terms of, because you're all very interested in political questions, and I'm less so, obviously. Somebody asked me, oh, Father, why don't you run for President of the United States? And I said, no, I have a higher calling. So, but I don't mean to tease you, politicians. You know, the work you do, I pray to St. Thomas More for you, that you don't lose your head doing it, you know. I think in the United States there is, right now, at this moment, a real polarization. The reasons for the polarization, I think, are more nuanced than what you read in the media, as is most often the case, because they just look for the headlines. I think there are very few in the United States on the political right, let's say, who are anarchists. There are some, but I think there are a few who are serious anarchists. You have a variety of people who want to see the state not impede the cohesion that can result from free social relationships and economic relationships. And hopefully you'd have a respectful debate among the prudential applications of that kind of limited government. There are the others now, and this is not, you know, a divide, you walk across this line and these people appear, but it's kind of a blend where people see and to put the best interpretation on it possible, and I think there's a parallel here obviously in Canada, that people are concerned that social needs are being met. And so they propose things like social businesses, social enterprises, social markets. But honestly, ask yourself, have you ever met a business that's not social? Who are you doing business with? Have you ever met a market that is not social? Of course it's social. Unless you mean something more by social than juxtaposing it to individual, right? What you mean by social is recognizing this solidarity, recognizing this empathy, this concern, this moral concern and bondedness we have with one another. Now, if that's what you mean, then don't juxtapose it to individual and make it sound like a business is individualistic. Because it's not. The minute it sells a single product, in fact, the minute it produces a single product, it's social. That is a social enterprise. Now, can't we have a conversation about how best to express this social reality? At times it's going to be various levels of government, but I think there are certain criteria before we bring in higher levels of government, precisely because of the knowledge question I alluded to earlier. They don't know.
How does that, we live in a society in which many of the other institutions of society, let's talk about the family, for example, which historically had played family breakdown. You know, there are many people living in social isolation and loneliness who don't have those networks. Where is the opportunity, you know, like, did that work better 20 years ago than it does today? And what are some of the things we can do in terms of addressing that issue?
I don't know, 20 years ago, I know 50 and 60 years ago, before we began these war on poverty programs and all of the rest of it, there's an interesting set of statistics, the source of which I read it in the book Losing Ground, but I forget the source that he cites, but it's available, indicating that the black family, which is really where the inner city African American family is where we have the greatest crisis now, approaching 75, in some areas 80% of out-of-wedlock births, and that's the predictor, out-of-wedlock births, not having a high school, completing high school, and not having a husband. Those are the three indicators, almost infallible, reliably predicting that this would be a person who's going to be in poverty, and a lot of the other attendant issues that go with that. That the African American family stability was approaching typical American family stability back in the 1950s and maybe the early 1960s. Now that's after slavery, that's after Jim Crow, that's after all of these other kinds of obviously racist actions against the black family, that it was still more stable. And then to come and help black families in the name of helping them, we have eviscerated. What I'm saying is that a lot of the problem you're identifying is precisely the result of inviting men out of the home. It's incentivizing people not to build intact, stable families that endure difficulties. And we've created a whole cultural problem as a result. Now that's harder to put the toothpaste back in the tube, but I think the way we go on that is not to increase the very thing. In other words, the cure becomes worse than the disease. So we have to find other ways of doing this.
You finished with the analogy of the tree and it's dying, and some may hear that to hear a call to go back to where we were. At the same time, you know, in Canada, and I suspect a similar trend is in the state, but certainly in Canada, you know, 11% of the Canadian population attended a place of worship in the last 7 days. The sort of that wellspring that once was part of our terrain is no longer part of the mainstream source of wisdom for the vast majority in our multicultural pluralistic society. How do we translate this into a way for genuine pluralism, respecting the fact that we are no longer a homogeneous society that looks to the same sources as the sources of moral virtue? If our ties are to be moral rather than political, as you argued, but we have no common source of morality, where in the pluralistic context do we find that?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is look for a grammar that incorporates as many people as possible in an intelligible discussion. For me, some form of natural law thinking that is not immediately identifiable with theology or coterminous with doctrinal commitments. Even in the world that I described there were, I mean, a lot of these people were Chinese immigrants, Jewish people, survivors of the deep sadness in Europe at the time, and different denominational configurations. Some of the most antagonistic relationships were between the Irish and the Italian Catholics, you know, so it's not a denominational bond as much it was a sense. And I think some kind of common grammar that enables us to speak frankly, honestly, that acknowledges that there are truths that exist. I think the most pernicious thing right now is this notion of a kind of relativism, that truth is up for grabs, you have your truth, I have my truth. I mean, I think we just need to think reasonably, sensibly about, I'm sorry to use a philosophical word in a political gathering, but epistemology, you know, that we know our minds and we know our minds can know things. We can reflect on our lives. There are truths that we confirm. I think the other thing that is, and maybe I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but I think a lot of believers, now this may not be the case here in Canada, but I know in the United States that a lot of believers only know how to argue from a theology of authority rather than to engage people winsomely, rather than to engage people reasonably. So why can't you do this? Because the Bible says you can't do it. Why can't you do this? Because the church says you can't do it. Rather than engaging people and pointing out, I mean, if I don't think there's a contradiction between reason and faith. I think these are two modes of knowing. And I think sometimes people who are of a conservative persuasion, in seeing the evisceration of authority in society, come back with even more, and I find it distasteful, and I think a lot of people who don't even grasp the theological contours of the argument find it particularly distasteful, and then caricaturize all conservatives in that way. And
Yesterday morning, Rex Murphy opened with a speech and talked about the tragic events that happened in this very city just a few months ago, and talked about sort of that patriotic impulse in which all of a sudden our identities disappeared and all Canadians were our neighbors and were our brothers. And I heard resonance in that of a certain sense of we are our brother's keeper.
Yes.
There is a sense of, you used the term solidarity.
Yes.
In political terms, that tends to be more associated with the left than the right often. Is there a way that those on the conservative side of the spectrum can reclaim, in the language of solidarity and patriotism, something of these moral principles that have a wide appeal regardless of one's faith?
The left is great at stealing good words. You know, I could give you a whole litany of words that I want back, especially Madonna. But solidarity it perfectly expresses the acknowledgement that we see ourselves in the other, don't we? I mean, it's just reality. The difference isn't that we are communal, that we are social beings. We are that, obviously. The difference between the left and the right, it seems to me, is that we don't think, at least I don't think, that solidarity is primarily, or in the first instance, expressed through political action or governmental action. I think the first place that human solidarity is expressed is in these relationships that I've been talking about. I mean, you know, everybody wants a clean environment, but nobody wants to take out the garbage. There's something wrong with this, right? I mean, we have to be personally involved. And I don't think it's a moral action to say, oh, the poor need to be fed, so I will take your money and give it to the poor. I mean, how does that benefit you morally by doing that, right? So I think we need to, you know, if it's a going back, it's a going back to being reasonable, thinking about things reasonably, and not just politically and not just in a utilitarian manner.
So we've identified three words at least, so patriotism, solidarity, responsibility. What about the other side of sometimes those on the right of the spectrum sort of take this concern and move it to the point where all structure is bad and somehow liberty is in license and absolute freedom? And how do is structure and order, not necessarily just governmental, but also all the other institutions of society and the right relationship with them, getting back to ethics being the right priority? Is there something about structure and order that needs to fit within that realm of vocabulary?
Of course. Of course we need structure and order. We can't even think if we don't have a sense of ordering and priorities. I mean, I think, let me give you another word, subsidiarity. This is a word that people, run away from because they think it's too complex. It's very simple, and it's everything that I've been saying, that needs are best met at the most local level of their existence, but it doesn't say that you can't go up to higher levels of social organization. So if you have a need, the first responder should be you. And then if you are unable to do that, your family and your extended family and your neighbors and your churches and all the other mediating institutions, which are, by the way, becoming eviscerated because of the violation of the principle of subsidiarity, where government jumps in first, so that people think, I don't need to support my parents because there are these social security schemes and stuff, and you have this intergenerational animosity that takes place. So it allows it to go up, but it never sees higher forms of social organization, government, as being the normative supply for all of the needs of society. It stands to guide, to frame, to protect, to enforce law so that people aren't abused. You have a rule of law, but then it recedes and then kind of keeps the thing rolling.
Good. Father Sirico, you began with using de Tocqueville as a visitor and mentioned the fact of how the visitors to your home noticed that the pup was growing up. I think as a visitor to Canada, you've identified some areas that we take well under advisement as we seek to also mature as a society. On behalf of all of us, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you all.